Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to continue on with our discussion of the different forms of mental illness and how they can be portrayed in fiction and how they may show up in your own life. Today what we're going to do is talk about anxiety specifically. Anxiety is the most common or the next most common form of mental illness. It's probably one or two tied with depression as far as how common it is. And so similar to depression, anxiety really almost should show up in your writings. And I think anxiety, in a weird way, lends itself very well to being portrayed in fiction. I'll explain that in a little bit. But anxiety is basically just fear. And it's a very broad sort of mental illness. There's a lot of things that fit in the anxiety disorder. So one is a very specific form of anxiety, which are phobias. Someone is perfectly fine throughout the day, except they have this thing that they're just terrified of. They're terrified of seeing it, of being around it, of experiencing it. Sometimes even just thinking about it can cause panic attacks or anxiety. But that's a very specific form of anxiety. Common forms are snakes. People are very afraid of snakes or spiders. Clowns are one, which I've never really actually gotten, but that's a common one. Actually, fear of death and dying is actually less than a lot of those, which tells me that the people aren't really necessarily afraid that, oh, the snake is going to bite me and kill me, because they're not, death is not always afraid. And sometimes they're afraid of other things too, and sometimes it's totally irrational, and they know that it's irrational. That's the definition of a phobia, it's an irrational fear. I mean, if you're walking through the woods and you come across a poisonous snake, it's actually good to be afraid of that snake in that moment, because it might bite you and it would suck. But if you're like in a shopping mall and you run out of a store because there was a little plastic snake, on a shelf or something, that's kind of getting in the realm of phobias. Then we get into a more like generalized anxiety disorder, which is usually more what I see, where people just have this background fear in their lives all the time. Not about anything specific. That's why we call it generalized anxiety disorder. It's not about anything in specific. It just is always there. And sometimes it will land on a particular thing that happens throughout the day. People will start to imagine something to be very worried about. A common one, which I'm kind of guilty of, is the fear that you've left the front door unlocked. Or the car door unlocked. My car makes a little beep noise when I lock it, so that kind of helps me. But I'll check my door a couple of times, before I leave, or especially when I go to bed. And it's not like a crippling fear, but it is one that I spend an extra amount of time addressing to make sure it goes away. But yeah, generalized anxiety disorder is probably one of the more common ones that I deal with, and people just have in the background. PTSD is an anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. People have experienced some sort of trauma. I think when we first discussed PTSD, it was originally around combat veterans, but now, of course, we now know it can be related to sexual assault, car accidents, violent crime, even just losing a job. Rather almost mundane things that a lot of people experience can still be traumatic. The way people were raised, moving around a lot when they're a young child. And what PTSD usually does is create a situation of hypervigilance. The brain is now hyper-wired and focused to be on the alert for that danger to come back, even long after the danger has passed. This is why combat veterans can still have problems with fireworks. As I'm recording this is the day after New Year's Eve, and a lot of veterans don't like New Year's Eve because people shoot off fireworks and there's lots of bangs and whistles and bright lights at night, and that freaks a lot of veterans out, especially American veterans, because someone said because we use so much night vision technology that we kind of like to prefer to have our operations happen at night. And so these guys are used to seeing, the black and green with the bright tracers going by and stuff like that, and it's very, very distressing. So even years after they are no longer in a combat situation, they can still be alerted, triggered. That's originally when we talked about triggered. That's what we were talking about. Was that sort of thing. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a anxiety disorder. It is not. This is one where it is not how it is portrayed in movies and stuff like that. If you watch Monk, the TV show about the detective, I think it's Tony Shalhoub was the actor in that. How everything has to be perfectly clean and spotless, and he can notice if a fork is just half a millimeter off at the wrong angle or ridiculous stuff like that. Most OCD doesn't look like that. Most people, in many ways, a lot of times, the rest of their lives is falling apart because they're so hyper-focused on this one obsession or this one compulsion. And so actually their house is like just garbage. If you watch Hoarders, a lot of those people on Hoarders actually have obsessive compulsive disorder. Nothing at all like how they show on Monk, but that's just how their mental illness focuses. And so with anxiety, what we're talking about is a very unhealthy, broken belief system. And this is how I always describe it to my clients. It's like your brain has a mantra that's constantly playing in the background. And that mantra always says something bad is going to happen, you're not going to be able to handle it, and someone's going to die. And that's kind of at the root of anxiety, because historically, go back to evolution, our ancestors, we didn't get worried over stupid bullshit. We didn't get worried about, is the Cowboys going to go to the Super Bowl this year, or how am I going to pay my bills? Our ancestors were worried about things that will kill them. Do I have enough food stored up for the winter? Is the rains going to come to water the crops? Will I be able to find buffalo? My child is sick. Is he going to get better, or is he just going to die? That was the things that our ancestors worried about. And that was the way our brains still work. That we believe something bad will happen, we probably won't be able to deal with it, and someone's going to die. And for the vast majority of people, at least in America, Western countries, survival's not really a concern. It just doesn't really hit us on a day-to-day basis. We should maybe be a little more worried about that in the healthy sense of living each day as if it were your last, because one day you'll be right. But for most of us, we don't have to worry about where our next meal is going to come from. We don't have to worry about having a roof over our head. We don't have to worry about a flood coming through and killing us and everybody that we know. Most people, that's not really a thing we have to worry about. But our brains haven't figured that out yet. And so we still have this sort of intense fear. And that's the reason why, panic attacks. People who've had panic attacks will say, I felt like I was going to die. And they're right. They felt like they were going to die. Their brain was lit up just as if they were in a life or death situation, even though they weren't. And what happens, especially with panic attacks, panic disorders, is people start to have anxiety about their anxiety. They are desperately afraid that they will feel that way again, and so then they try and do everything they can to avoid feeling that way, which just keeps them locked in this perpetual state of anxiety, not as bad as a panic attack, but still really, really bad. And so that's the key to overcoming anxiety, is unwinding that unhealthy mantra and turning it into something bad will happen. Because hate to say it, that's how the world works. Something bad will happen. So something bad will happen. You will handle it, and nobody's going to die. And that's the new, healthier mantra. Now, the way you handle it, you may not like. You may not like how you handle it. It may not be very comfortable. It may not be very easy, but you'll survive because nobody's going to die. And once we really internalize that mantra and we start using it, then we can start challenging this anxiety. And then the next phase of the treatment is to experience the anxiety, because that's really how you get over it. You're going to have to experience the anxiety and then realize, oh, wait, the worst thing that I imagined that could happen didn't happen. I think it was, I don't know who said it. I want to say Mark Twain, but that doesn't seem right. But he said, the worst things in my life never actually happened to me, or something along those lines. So, how to use anxiety in fiction. The reason why I think anxiety is really great in fiction is because of that unhealthy, that unwinding of the unhealthy mantra, that you take your hero and you put them in a situation in which they are afraid. Maybe they're legitimately afraid, like with Saga the Scout. Ethan is experiencing the world going crazy. People are just trying to kill each other. Barbarians are jumping out from a pit in the ground. They're running around murdering people. And he is terrified. His father just got killed, and his sister seems to be joining in on the massacre. And by the way, this is all chapter 1. So, that tells you how the book starts. And so he has a legitimate need to be afraid. And then the rest of the book is about him overcoming these fears. He gets in other situations in which he should be afraid, but he isn't, because he keeps dealing with his anxiety, but it keeps getting ramped up and that sort of thing. And that's what you can do with a lot of your characters. And the great thing about that is, I'm describing this sort of post-apocalyptic science fantasy kind of setting. You can do the exact same thing in a romance. How many romantic comedies are basically about, the guy really likes the girl and she's so pretty, but oh man, he's so nervous and he doesn't want to talk to her. And the whole movie is about him working up the nerve to talk to her, and he tries and he fails and he looks like an idiot. And, she just seems to be clueless about what's going on. And of course it's romance, so he gets the girl at the end and it's happily ever after, that sort of thing. Horror, of course, is all about that. Now, horror, the rules are a little different. You can kill people in horror. You can kill everybody in horror if you want. And so you can have a protagonist who's afraid, who's overcoming his fear, and gets killed anyway. But it's horror. It's meant to make you afraid. So it's really trying to push that anxiety button really hard. But yeah, adventure stories, fantasy stories, science fiction, doesn't matter. Anytime you put a character in danger, whether it's actual physical danger or social danger or just emotional danger, it's all in their head, then you give them a chance to push back and overcome and rise above that. And it's similar to depression, though, is that in real life, a lot of people with anxiety don't do anything. But that's not the characters you want to write. Characters who don't do anything don't make for interesting characters. Now, maybe you can take a character who really would rather just stay home and do nothing, but the world keeps pulling them in. That's interesting. That's a good character. But unfortunately, a lot of lazy people are really just anxious people. And this is a good segue into your writing, because I think this is a good way to think about it. It's like procrastination is usually not about laziness. People don't sit around and not write their book because they're lazy. Lazy people, true lazy people, don't even have any motivation to even think about writing a book. Usually what procrastination is about is anxiety. It's about fear. It's about fear of failing. That's a big one. Fear of looking stupid. That's another pretty big one. Fear of wasting their time. Fear of wasting their money. Fear of just sort of making a mistake. Fear of embarrassing somebody. That sort of thing. And so if you find that you aren't writing, and part of your brain is telling you should be writing, you need to be writing, even maybe another part of your brain is like, I really want to write, I think I like it and it makes me feel good, but you still always manage to come up with an excuse, watch another episode on Netflix or another YouTube video, not this one, but that can sometimes be your anxiety, and it's kind of worth kind of poking at that to find out what am I really anxious about? What's keeping me? What am I afraid of? And is that fear legitimate? And even if it is a legitimate fear, which most of the time it's not, but even if it is a legitimate fear, is there a way to mitigate it? If there's a fear of like, oh, what I really want to do is write hot, steamy romances and with a lot of bondage and lesbians, but I don't want my born-again Christian aunt to read this. Use a pen name. Almost every erotica author and a lot of romance writers don't use their real name just for this very reason. So kind of figure out if you're what you're anxious about, if that anxiety is legitimate, and if it can be addressed somehow. And if it can't, then the next thing that I usually go with, I talk about my clients with this a lot, and I have to do this with myself, is like, okay, what's the reasonable worst case scenario, worst case outcome of this fear? Reasonable, I'm throwing the reasonable part too, because our brains are creative, and if you're a writer and you're watching this, you've got a very creative brain. You can invent all sorts of worst case scenarios, which are just totally implausible or just so highly unlikely that they're not even worth considering. But the way our anxiety works is it makes us feel like it's totally real. We have to consider it. So you do have to be a little objective. Sometimes this can be a good thing to talk about with other people to try and get their input on how reasonable is my worst case scenario. And when you think of that, what that worst case scenario is, ask yourself, can I live with that? I really want to write hot, steamy romances about S&M and lesbians, and I'll come up with a pen name, but if my aunt reads it and finds out, what's going to happen? Well, she probably won't talk to me. Well, I don't really like her anyway, Or actually, no, she's great. She loves me, and I think she would be totally understanding. It's that sort of thing. And then just sort of ask yourself, okay, well, can you live with that? And so I hope you found this useful. Anxiety is one of those very broad topics, and I'm just touching a few highlights. It impacts so many people's lives, especially a lot of writers, a lot of creative types. I didn't even get into things like imposter syndrome, which is another form of anxiety. But yeah, there's all sorts of different directions to go with this sort of thing. But in the comments, if you would, just tell me, do you struggle with anxiety? Do you feel like that's what's keeping you from writing or keeping you from doing the things that you want to do? What sort of tips and tricks have you learned to deal with it? Do you use anxiety in your writing? Are your characters anxious? Do you kind of let it kind of manifest in your creative process? But anyway, I will talk to you later. Bye.